Okay, well, welcome to Michele Lalor, our textbook author. We're very excited to have her here. And thank you so much for your willingness to help our elementary curriculum class learn more about assessment.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to work with pre-service teachers. I think it's a great opportunity to interact and to talk about how theory or ideas in a book actually come into practice. And as you know, because you're using my text, Ensuring High Quality Curriculum, that is one of the publications that I have. I actually just published my second book, which is called Making Curriculum Matter. That is about taking curriculum and using it as a tool to address valued outcomes. So it's a continuation of high quality curriculum. It's taking the ideas of the different attributes of quality and saying, how do we really use them to address what really matters in the classroom? So I'm here today to talk to you from New York. As you know or can tell from my, I've said this before, but as you can tell from my accent, I am from New York. It's pretty heavy, but I do not live in the city as many people think. This is actually a view from the beach that's about 5 miles from my house. So I'm here on Long Island. It's where I grew up and spent a great part of my life. I actually started doing professional development here on the island, but now travel to different parts of the country. And I always see my responsibility as sharing the stories of the teachers that I work with. So when you're reading a story in either of the books, they are coming from experiences with teachers. So I feel that it's really important that I share those great practices that I see with others so they can learn from that as well. So as you have been reading in the book, the curriculum design process is a 3-part process. It begins with conversations about desired results. What is it you want students to know and be able to do? It moves on to assessments, which is how will you know that they've met those outcomes? And then answers the third question, which is how are you going to support students on their journey? The book talks about curriculum design, which is unit design, but this philosophy of starting off with expectations, what you want students to know and be able to do, and then moving to how will you know and how will you support them, is applicable to daily lessons as well. So the philosophy exists that we always design with some type of result in mind. What is it we want students to know and be able to do? So what we're going to do during the 45 minutes that we're here together is we're going to examine 2 things. These are our outcomes. First, we're going to take a look at the importance of alignment in curriculum and lesson design. So the idea of how do you start off with the answer to that question, what do I want my students to know and be able to do, and make sure that every decision that you're making along the way is aligned to that outcome. And the second question, or the second point that we're going to address, is how formative assessments are used to monitor student learning and to adjust instruction. So as students are working towards this goal, how are you checking in with them to make sure that they're truly learning what your intention is? And then if they're not, how can you address it? Or if they are, how can you deepen their learning? So let's start with that first point. I'm going to tell you a little story, and it begins with the idea. It's called the goalpost, the trip, and the marathon. And this explains the importance of really being clear about those desired results. So if you've ever been to a football game or a soccer match or any kind of sport where there's some kind of goal or basket in mind, we know that that is the end goal, right? So the idea is that's where you're going, that at the end of the game, whoever is going to have the most goals or the most points is going to win. When you plan a trip, we know that you plan a trip based on a destination. So you take a look, you look at your options, where am I planning to go? And then you think about all of the different ways that you possibly could get there and the routes perhaps that you might take. but your destination is really your end goal. And when you're running in a race, this is actually me running in the 2015 New York City Marathon, there's an end goal. The end goal in that case is to finish, right? So everybody's running the same route, but they're taking, it's taking them different amounts of time. They're using a different plan, but the route and the destination stays the same. These three things have in common that the goal, the desired result, is what is fostering all the decisions that are made along the way. All right. So in a football game, you want the score, but the plays are all going to be different, right? The coaches are going to make decisions about what those plays are going to be, but the end goal is the goal itself. When you're on a trip, the destination is where you're headed, but how you get there, how many stops along the way, the mode of transportation, that's going to be different depending on your starting point. And when you think about a marathon, the end goal is to finish the marathon. How long it takes you is going to vary on the person. Their strategy for running is going to be different based on their experiences. So while it takes me 5.5 hours to run a marathon, by the time I start, the first person has already finished, I get it done. The destination, the goal, and the finish line are all directly correlated to those desired results. So when you think about your planning, when you think about how am I going to design a unit or how am I going to design a lesson, you have to think about your desired result, the destination, the goal, the finish line. And that is going to give you the information that you need to determine what students are going to do, how you're going to monitor their learning, and how you're going to support them. So in education, the destination, the goal, the finish line really are articulated through standards. And this is something that you've read about in my book. Standards are articulating the desired results. How we arrange standards, the choice of standards that we select for a unit or for a lesson will determine what students are going to do. The idea, the concept that we want to reinforce is that you want strong alignment to the standards. That means that you want whatever you've identified as your desired results, you want the activity the students engage in and the way that you monitor their understanding, the formative assessment, to align to that final goal. Okay, so here's an example for you. This is an example that comes from a lesson. Okay, so we're not talking about a unit, we're talking about a lesson. A lesson could be 1 or 2 days of instruction. A unit would be multiple days. The desired result is the guiding question and the learning target. So how does where you live impact how you live? A learning target takes that guiding question and puts it in language that students can use and understand. I can make a comparison to determine how people live in different communities. And then there's a learning activity. The learning activity should strongly align to the goals that have been articulated through the guiding question and the learning target. So if students take a look at 2 pictures, 2 images, one of a farm, one of a city, we're taking a look at rural and urban communities. They would then examine those and complete an activity where they can take a look at the similarities and differences. So this is a visual routine. This is a thinking map. It's a double bubble map. Double bubble maps are a little different than Venn diagrams. Venn diagrams are great for comparison, but in a double bubble map, they're mirror images. So on the outside, you're doing a comparison of how the 2 communities are different. And down the center, you're showing how they're the same. If we go back to our guiding question and learning activity, you'll see that when students examine the image, and they compare using the double bubble map of what's similar and different, you have strong alignment to your guiding question and learning target. So strong alignment is when what the students are doing and the target itself are so intertwined that you really can't tell the difference between the two. So let's have you try this out. Here is the standard. So take a second to read your standard and take a second to read the classroom learning experience. And in your mind, I'm going to ask you to determine the degree of alignment. Is it strong? So the two are intertwined. Moderate, which means that the students are addressing the standard with a slight change to the activity. It could be in more alignment. And weak, which means they might be touching upon it, but it's really left dependent on what happens. It's not pre-planned for strong alignment. So take a second and read the classroom learning experience and compare it to the standard. And now what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to put in the chat box a Google form. And if you would take a quick second, if you click onto the Google form, it is going to take you to a form that's going to ask you the question, how well does the task align with the standard? Is it strong, moderate, or weak? Okay, so let's go with the responses that we have. You can see the majority of you felt that the task was moderate. So let's go back to the task. Okay, so if you look at the results, you're going to see here the 15 responses. We have 11 that saw the alignment between the task and the learning target as being moderate. So let's go back and look at the task itself and see if we can think about and talk through why moderate and not strong, why moderate and not weak. So perhaps one or two of you can put into the chat box why you made the selection on either strong, moderate, or weak. Okay, so we have one of the students, Mackenzie, thank you, is saying that the experience was not very specific to the standard, so it wasn't strong. I can agree with that. I think there's definitely things that were missing from the learning experience that doesn't make it strong. Moderate, because the illustration doesn't really address the why. Thank you, Rebecca. That is definitely one of the reasons why that, or how the classroom learning experience could be improved. If it asked students to create a visual representation that illustrated the different stages and why those stages occurred, we would have a stronger alignment. Anything else that might be included in the directions that would strengthen it? There's an assumption in this learning experience. What is the assumption? It assumes that the students know about the life cycle of the plant, yes. And it also assumes that they're actually going to use the text to do it. So whenever you have a place where there can be that assumption, it's really better to include the information in the directions, because that makes it more strongly aligned to the standard itself. So it's a good classroom learning experience. It does align with the standard, but there's a place where it can be strengthened. So the one thing you want to do when you're planning your lessons is you want to make sure that you're very clear about what you want students to get out of the experience, and then you plan your learning experience so that it is strongly aligned to that outcome. So let's go a little further with this. In addition to planning your lessons this way, we can't just make the assumption that because there's a learning activity that strongly aligns to a learning target, that means that the students are going to learn it. That's where the importance of assessment comes in. So I'm not sure if you've gotten to the chapter in the book that's on assessment, but in the chapter on assessment types and moments, I explain that teachers use assessments for different purposes. They use them for diagnostic purposes, formative, and summative. So a diagnostic occurs at the beginning of a learning cycle, and that learning cycle can be the beginning of a unit, it can be the beginning of a lesson, but it's somewhere in the beginning because what the teacher is trying to get is information about what the students know, as well as their misconceptions, and then uses it as a starting point for instruction. So that's done at the beginning. Diagnostic assessments should be documented. They should not be graded because they're just a measure of what my students know in relationship to this learning target. And really, they're designed for that adjustment of where to begin, how to move students from where they are to the desired result. A formative assessment, which I think is best defined as a check for understanding, is used to make instructional decisions. So it's happening while learning is taking place. It also is not graded for grading and reporting purposes. It's documented because the teacher can use that information to make adjustments to instruction. A summative assessment occurs at the end, and it is there to evaluate. Those summative assessments tend to be used for grading and reporting purposes. So you could use all different types of assessments for different purposes. It is the purpose that determines whether or not it's a diagnostic, formative, or summative. Some assessments can be used for all three. So for example, a writing assignment. A writing assignment the first draft can be considered to be a diagnostic because it's a way for the teacher to check in with the students to say, start off the unit to say, what can my students do as writers? So I know what kind of instruction they need. The students can then apply those lessons to a second draft. The teacher can collect them, figure out what the next set of lessons should be, provide students with feedback, and that's considered a formative assessment. And then finally, when the teacher collects the last draft, that's the summative assessment. And even at that point, it's used for grading and reporting purposes. The teacher can use that information to inform the next writing task. So it can be a continuous cycle, but it's what you do with the information that's so important. Formative assessments is really where the learning takes place, right? A formative assessment are all those kinds of activities that a teacher uses to make decisions about what happens next and to support the students. So every single lesson has a formative assessment built into it, right? As you're reading through these different examples, these are just descriptions of different kinds of lessons that students can engage in the classroom. Notice that they're all written in terms of what the students will do. Right? That's really important because if you're going to use a formative assessment, you're measuring student learning. So we have to be concerned with what the students are doing. The teacher is there supporting. So you read through them, you should be able to see that any tangible or observable piece of evidence in the lesson itself is considered a formative assessment. So one of the things that you may be thinking is, when I think of the term assessment, I think test. Not all assessments are tests. When any piece of evidence of student learning, it can be considered a formative assessment if a teacher uses it to adjust instruction. Until there is some impact on what the teacher has, it's just a formative assessment opportunity. When the teacher uses the information, it truly becomes a formative assessment. So when you're looking through these different examples, what you should notice is that there's all different kinds of formative assessments here. One is a model, one is the ranking of supporting evidence, another is annotating examples, another is listing reasons. Each of these are giving information to the teacher about what the students know. So they're all underlined. What's in bold print is information about why. The why is the learning target. And that's where you get the close association between what students are doing and the desired results. So now a teacher has information about how students are progressing towards that desired result. Formative assessment has been shown in research to have a great impact on student learning. But here in the United States, we've done a really good job of identifying formative assessment opportunities. So we're very good at saying, okay, this is a formative assessment. I can collect this. We have actually standardized formative assessments. There's programs out there. Students can do, 4 or 5 multiple choice questions. Teacher uses that as a formative assessment. And we've even done a really great job of collecting all that data. But a formative assessment, as I said to you before, really has its greatest impact on student learning when there's a response from the teacher. So here is an example. Students read an excerpt of a text. They write a reader's response. The teacher checks the reader's response to see if students can use the text to support their analysis. And then based on that information, the teacher splits the students up into 3 groups, and each group engages in a different activity based on what the teacher learned about the students as a result of reading their reader responses. So it's in the response of the teacher that you get the greatest impact on learning. And what I want to do with our final segment is give you a chance to watch a video of this in action and then to discuss it with your peers. So there's 3 questions I want you to focus on as you watch the video. So you may want to jot them down. How does the teacher use the learning target? How well aligned is the task? And what evidence does the teacher have of student learning? So those are the 3 questions. And we are going to watch a video with those questions in mind. What's the learning target? How's the teacher monitoring student learning? What evidence does a teacher collect? Okay, here we go.
Cambridge, would you mind reading our first learning target today?
I can get the gist and determine the main idea in a newspaper article about...
The text I chose for today's class was an article from the Buffalo News about a Seneca school called Faith Keepers that teaches a lot about Seneca language and culture. Look at some of the important words in there. What's an important word in this learning target? Go ahead, Javier.
Seneca.
This Seneca. Right now, the 5th graders are studying the idea of culture through various case studies. Mainly, they're focusing in on indigenous Native American peoples of Western New York. What's another important word that we're looking at, Mr. Sapa?
Main idea.
Main idea. What is that big idea that's really important to the author? In an assessment that I've given my students recently, I would notice that they weren't picking out really important details, especially as they relate to the main idea. So this lesson was really designed to help kids to see the connection between important details and main idea. What's another important word that we're looking at? Christian.
Gist.
Gist. What is the gist? I'm asking you to jot the gist in the margin. What are you writing about?
The important parts of the story or article.
Yeah, or what it's about, right? Today we're going to be starting a close read of a brand new text. I want you to think about all the close reading we've done before. We do a close reading process in my classroom, and it's often a multi-day process. And the first time kids read, they're reading just to get the flow of the text from the beginning to the end. And this is sort of a low-stakes moment in reading. And I want you just to read for the flow, all right? Show some perseverance. The second time they go back to the text, they're annotating it in several different ways in order to help them understand it. Circling important words and jotting the gist in the margins. If you're having a hard time, if this text feels really difficult to you, what is something you can do as a reader to help you to get through it and to make it a little more manageable?
Get the gist in baby steps.
Get the gist in baby steps. Take bite-sized sections, little paragraphs, right? Do I understand this paragraph? Do I understand this paragraph? And go through section by section.
I started reading the article by reading the whole thing just for the flow.
I used to do a lot more scaffolding and pre-reading activities before I let kids have a turn with the text. Something I've noticed about my students is that now that they're used to reading a text on their own for the first time and trying it out, they've shown a lot more perseverance.
And then I read it again and underlined all the important words, like traditional, the school, and some of the names.
Choosing a text is always a really important process for me in teaching something like this. I was really looking for something that was an authentic text, something from a primary source, like a newspaper article, something within what they were studying so that it had a real purpose for them in reading it. And I needed something that was complex, something that pushed them, something that taught them new vocabulary, new academic vocabulary.
After every section I read, I wrote the gist down. And I went back in the paragraph to see if I was right, and then I went to the next one.
I gave my whole class the same complex text. And one reason for this is that we found differentiation is less about text complexity and more about the amount of text the student is asked to work with. For some students, they're able to differentiate for themselves by chunking the text into smaller pieces.
I'm doing the gist for 2 paragraphs at a time. Demon Dowdy and his wife, Sandy, started the Seneca Faith Keepers.
For other students, we actually break the text up for them so that they only see a smaller amount of text at a time and don't become overwhelmed by the idea of what they're about to read. So look back at the title, look at some of those important details you underlined, look at the gists you wrote. I want you to jot your idea for this. What do you think the main idea of this article is? And then in about 2 minutes, we're going to transition ourselves over to the carpet area to continue the second half of our lesson. We read about it, we thought about it, we wrote about it, now we get a chance to talk about it. Jada, do you mind reading our second learning target for today?
I can explain the connection between details and the main idea in an article about the Seneca people.
You're going to choose one person near you, and you're talking about what do you think the main idea of this article is? And then what is one thing in the article, one little sentence that helped you come up with that main idea? So in the activity today, I really wanted students to build a connection between important details and the main idea. I chose the details I wanted them to work with and hung them on charts around the classroom. And students moved around in groups with Post-it notes, read the detail, and had to make a case for whether or not that detail was important and connected to the main idea. Working with complex text can be really challenging, and these kids are 10 years old, so they get really antsy. So I try to design my lessons in ways that give them time to get up and move around the room. Talking to each other about text as much as possible, and it allows them to understand parts of text that maybe they didn't understand on their own, but can get from up here. I want to debrief with this question. What detail did you think was important? How did it connect to the main idea?
The one about the children learn about traditional songs. One of the details I thought was important on the wall was that some of the traditions are like, for the Seneca people, are like singing and dancing. I thought that was an important detail because it like tells you the tradition.
I use a close reading process because it gives the kids predictability in how they approach a text, and they've shown themselves to be much more willing to deal with a challenge. All right, let's do one more. Let's do one more. What's a detail? Mr. Sapa.
I did attending the school is a major commitment for.
Okay, everybody. Oh, okay. So what we're going to do right now is I'm going to thank you, Sarah, for putting the questions in there that you should be going off into groups to discuss. So we want to focus on what was the learning targets, what evidence did the teacher have of student learning? And then, of course, how the teacher responded. Okay, so the questions are in the chat box for you. I'm just going to put you into random breakout rooms. I know we don't have too much time left, so about 5 minutes in those rooms, okay? I popped into one of the rooms. I want to make sure everybody has a few minutes for questions too. Okay, a few more people coming in. Okay, everybody. I did pop into one of the rooms just to introduce myself and to chat a little bit. But I want to take us back to the video, and then I want to give everybody a few minutes to answer some questions. So the video is an example of how a teacher shares the desired results through the learning target. So students really need to know what they're supposed to learn so that they can monitor their own learning. So here are two of the learning targets that the teacher shared with the students. I can get the gist and determine the main idea. I can explain the main idea based on the details of the text. You'll notice in these learning targets, they don't focus on the task. They focus on what students are supposed to learn. And that's a really well-written learning target. So I can get the gist and determine the main idea. Could have been written as I can annotate the text in the margin, but that's focusing on what students would be doing. So here the teacher is focusing on the skill the students will be learning. Then if you read the learning activity, you'll get a description of what the students are going to do. This is where the action comes in. So students read, they annotate, and they write the main idea. That's what they're doing. The why is because they want to determine the main idea. It matches up with your learning target. And then the formative assessment is what the teacher can collect. So there's two built right into the lesson, the annotation and the writing of the main idea. So any lesson, a real quality lesson, is going to have that strong alignment throughout. And what the teacher is collecting to monitor student learning is going to give the teacher the information to see how well the students have learned it, and then the teacher can adjust instruction. And you'll see in the second example, the same thing. So the big takeaways. Here are some questions for you to consider when you're planning. Woo, I just lost the screen. There you go. First, what is the learning intention? So what is the desired results? What are the students doing to demonstrate that? So what's the active learning activity? Why needs to match the learning target? What's the evidence? That's the formative assessment moment. And what does the teacher plan to do in response? So to go from a formative assessment moment or opportunity to one that's really going to impact student learning. So as we get to the end of our session together, now I'm going to use the last 5 minutes or so just to give you some time to process and to share what you've learned as a result of our time together. And to ask questions, of course.